Morning and welcome to today's virtual program. My name is Marianna Pegno and I'm the Curator of Community Engagement here at the Tucson Museum of Art. So thank you for joining us today for Indigenous Arts and Community Curation to take a closer look at the process for developing the new Indigenous Arts exhibition here at the Tucson Museum of Art, which if you haven't come and checked it out, we are open Thursdays through Sundays and we look forward to seeing you in the near future. This project, and by extension the discussion today, was made possible in part by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And the views, findings, conclusions, recommendations, and things we're going to share today in this program do not necessarily represent those views of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. But I am thrilled to be sharing this virtual space today with three amazing colleagues and collaborators. So today's discussion will include introductions of all of us who are presenting. So we'll start with me, you'll get to keep hearing from me, and then we'll go to Colleen, Ruben, and end with Christine. Then we'll transition to a discussion that is guided by two key questions. Can you talk about this exhibition or process and how it addresses or speaks to ideas of identity, sovereignty, and assimilation? And can you share some reflections about this exhibition process as it speaks to a changing curatorial process? Then we'll transition to Q&A from the audience. So normally in these kind of virtual settings, I am kind of the background person, right? I run the Zoom, I do the introductions, but you're going to hear a little bit about who I am and what I do here at the museum today. So in my role as the Curator of Community Engagement here at the Tucson Museum of Art, I find myself sometimes in weird situations, as you can see with these two photos of myself, but always trying to find new ways to innovate on the museum experience. So for me, community engagement, I'm always looking for ways to foster a relevant, culturally responsive, interactive, and community-based institution. And that means for me, I'm looking to foster relationships or connections between TMA, so the museum here, and residents of Southern Arizona. Often for me, this can be seen by working beyond the museum walls, listening to recommendations from partners or collaborators, an openness to change course and heed to another's expertise, developing ongoing or sustained relationships, and considering what it means to work within an equity framework here at TMA. So how did that translate to what we did with the Indigenous arts? Well, with this exhibition, my role became an internal instigator or perhaps advocate for change. I was looking for ways to build connections or bridges between TMA and the communities we aim to engage and collaborate with. I facilitated conversations. I listened to advice, recommendations, and concerns. I made sense of all kind of these different ideas that were coming together. I mediated between the institution and the collaborators. And perhaps most importantly, I created a lot of reports to share back what we were finding and talking about. That was really key for us to kind of validate, check in regarding our direction. So one of my favorite moments in this whole process was during the share back we did kind of in November. Where I guess I was nervous, or I'm just used to kind of checking in with everybody to make sure things are going okay. And I was constantly asking if anybody had comments or concerns or questions. And finally, Ruben told me that I didn't have to keep asking. When anybody had a comment or concern, they would definitely chime in. Ruben, I don't know
remember that.
I was gonna say, I don't know if you remember this. But sometimes it still kind of makes me giggle because it's kind of this perfect illustration of me. I was constantly in need to like see if anybody wanted to say anything. I was worried about making space, but also it reminded me that silence isn't anything to stress about. So for me, these are kind of these things that I was thinking about in this process. And you can see two photos from my my notebook here. So where I'm like drawing, taking notes and starring important things. And this is kind of how I was trying to make sense of what we were all talking about. Anyway, enough from me for right now. So I'm going to turn it over to Colleen to introduce herself.
Hello,
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Depin Manayan Hopi Matiwa. My name is Colleen Lucero, my English name, and I'm Hopi, and I'm from the village of Hopewella, and I'm Kachina clan, and I participated in a project as a community curator. I was responsible for helping them out and bridging some areas of information. And in the very beginning, I had expressed both to um, Marianna and Christine that like this little disclaimer, like although I'm Hopi and have the best intentions for my people, I do not know everything and can't speak on areas that are not privileged to me. Um, Pertaining to the societies I don't belong to, knowledge bestowed to men, and clan knowledge of other families. But what I can provide is what I'm allowed about my clan, my role as a Hopi woman, mother, sister, aunt, niece, and community member. I try to balance that with my museum professions and education. So my role as a community curator, I help provide resources, respected information allowable to share, and I edited some of the Hopi terminology and spellings, um, contextualized the collection's information, and provided some curator statements and revised labels for exhibit. These are just images. The past image was from the spring where I do a lot of planting in my community at our terrace, the women's terrace gardens. And then these are just some of the roles as Hopi women we partake in. We got the basket dance, that is a women's dance, and then also, providing life and with these cycles of we do in our cultural calendar. So I just kind of wanted to briefly share with you what that is. So thank you everybody for having me here. I appreciate the time and the experience being a community curator. Thank you.
Hello, Shramai Masama Wusi Japim, Anyang Abjogik Ruben Naranjo, Anyam Chukron Watamajukam, Huganya Joe, but I'm going to Wavasik Namamajit, Guganya Olga Batkanhu, Igojit Watamajukam. Good morning to everyone. My name is Ruben Naranjo. My mother is from the community of Gomshkut Wawasit. It's also known as Sal's. My dad is from what we call the other side, or from Mexico. So I'm half Anthem and half Hispanic. My contributions towards this project was as a consultant for the baskets that were chosen, the Apache and the Hopi, the Anthem. I also contributed a calendar stick, or a form of calendar stick. It's a method of recording community, local, or personal history. And my focus was on the Tohono women who would walk all the way from Sanavir, a distance of 9 miles, to sell pottery in and around the area of Tucson, probably beginning from the very first contact with non-natives, all the way up until like the 20s and 30s when refrigeration and cooling became easier for storing water. A nice cold drink from a clay olla is always welcome. I think anybody who's ever had a drink out of a water jar would agree with me. And that's pretty much my introduction. I hope I covered everything. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Christine Brindza, and I'm the Senior Curator and James and Louise Glasser Curator of Art of the American West here at TMA. And it's been a privilege to work with our community curators, so with Colleen and Ruben, and with the other people on this committee, along with Marianna Pegno, who has been my partner in crime now for a few years, and a few more years yet to come. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself and my position during this project. And before I flip onto the next slide, I just want to tell you about this crazy picture here. This is a moment where we received a collection for an exhibition a few years ago. And I was geeking out over the artwork that was inside these crates. And so I just want to show you the other side of a curator that you may not see. Sometimes you see our photos where we have our arms folded and we look very serious, but that's not always the case. And so I just wanted you to see that other side of us. Now, I wanted to recognize that I have a certain positionality in this project, that I have been working in a traditional structure of museums and curatorial field for over 15 years. And so I have been trained to put together exhibitions a certain way. And we can go into a little bit more detail later as to what that structure really is. But I have had some feelings as my position as a curator that I'm a type of educator. And so this really goes hand in hand with that philosophical feeling I have had about myself in doing this co-curation, community-based project. And so over the years, and of course, Marianna's worked with me on several of these projects, we've been willing to try other methods related to education, fostering arts appreciation, and looking for ways to reach new audiences. So I wanted to mention very early on in this project that I had to change my usual role as a curator, because it's usually one in a position of control and using one's expertise. So I had to change that position to be one of an active listener. So listening was an important component to learn about what others were bringing to the table, being open about the group's feelings, and reflecting on what was being said. I feel like this part of the project helped inform me of what to expect, what I could contribute, and how we could work together. And so I feel that that was a very stable place to be early on.
So in order, now that you've kind of heard a little bit from us to just get an idea of who we are and kind of where we're coming at this position and this exhibition development, we're now going to kind of share some insights and some stories about the process, what we've learned, and kind of using these two questions as our guiding framework. So we're kind of speaking in a similar vein, so we're not all over the place, which probably is more of an issue for me because my brain goes in 120 different directions. But anyway, to get us started with this, we are gonna have Colleen share some of her insights.
Okay, hopefully you guys can hear me a little bit better. So I wanted to briefly talk about consultation versus collaboration. Consultation is every first step for collaboration. It should not just be a check on your to-do list, but several interactions of conversation. Important information and recommendations, protocol, which require oversight from each party, is provided in these conversations. So it's very important to have that open dialogue open over several conversations, not just saying, oh yeah, we talked to them and they were fine with it, so we're gonna put this up. With that, there has been major shifts since the implementation of the Native American Graves Protection Act that opened many doors and concerns for each tribe. No tribe is ever the same, including the work they do. Some tribes like mine, we do not have a tribal museum or repository So in those cases, we have a very unique working relationship with our outside entities. Um, Positive outcomes are correcting misidentified objects, correction in catalogs, and all of this affects student dissertations, the degrees they're getting, and also the research. So it's in the best interest that you consult to collaborate. Um, um, so we did a lot of shared authority and kind of weighing what our major takeaways and benefits were in this exhibit. So we circulated several documents that are already out there and how to guide these conversations and what protocols or guidelines we may have instilled within each tribe or generally in different Native communities. As I mentioned before, we are all not the same. And these documents were the Hopi Cultural Preservation's Office Intellectual Property Rights. It's very important to kind of remind people about, although our information is out there, we still need for it to be circulated respectfully in a way that's not harmful to our communities. And then also the School of Advanced Research guidelines for museums and communities. So if you guys need help with locating those, please email us and we'll get those links to you. And so I was quick to remind them, like, Hopi is more than the black and white photos often portrayed in many museums. We're very much alive and living. And so in this is that the question of how we manage cultural bias. We need to bring forth a new level of collaboration, contextualize your collections aesthetically. Who's to say how it should look? On one hand, a conservator would not want to damage an item in everyday use, but for a tribe, that may be the main reason for its creation. There are always ways to maneuver through that. Being willing to endure the process, it becomes a growing responsibility between both parties. So on the photo, you see on your left how we use it day to day in our tribe to dry things. There's some spinach here that was foraged. And then on the right, you have them, how you often see them in museums as being pristine and managed. And so we're able to show you and talk about how the uses of them are not just to be on the wall, so to speak. And so this is where we come into community collaboration. So the ethical approach to understand the concerns of the tribe does not work with people who generally don't care. Being better is by doing better, not to feel threatened or challenged by community members that may know better. Community knowledge should not be dismissed when you're consulting with the tribes. Every little symbol has a meaning, and there is an evolving thought process to caring for in all we do, and we teach those in all spaces of learning, whether it be objects such as pottery. You see the people caring for them, being very delicate in the process, so that way you're able to deliver a beautiful objects. And that's the same way we think about our everyday life in people. You see here a great grandmother, embracing her child. That's kind of how we believe in all we do. And so there's a huge other level of community curation that can be shared with these institutions to make them understand about how we feel about the objects and what their creations were for. And then I just wanted to share about how, like I said, we're not always black and white. We are very much alive and living in our communities and trying to embrace what our ancestors left, and not only just for our tribe, but to share for everybody. We make our prayers, we have intentions for, worldwide. We don't just think about ourselves. And I think now during this time, it had us really reflect on that with what's going on in the world with the pandemic, and being able to fall back on these principles, values, and most of all, stewardship. And so just wanted to share a little bit of saying we're alive and well, and we're very much proud of who we are. And we like to share that with everybody. And so these are just some of the internal documents that we had shared with each other through this process. Like I said, we're in COVID, so we weren't able to, hey, let's meet up and have lunch, we did a lot of Zoom conversations, email conversations, texting. So we were just sending these documents back and forth, the MOU for the consultation service. And that ended up changing some of the language in there and updating it, which we didn't anticipate and had nothing to do with the show, but that kind of happened in the process. And then the catalog of collections, we were able to update information and kind of generalize some of it that didn't need to be in there, but it was important information for I'm sure the museum side, but to make it more understandable for us, we kind of added and took away some information. And then I was curious as to the past exhibits of Hopi at TMA and the inventory of those items. And we were able to select items that had never been on exhibit, which were able to be shared. And then we noticed that we didn't have one type of basket. And so I said, if you really want to, showcase what our craft is all about and how we have different types of baskets, you really should get a sifter basket, to make it complete. And so we got that through a private loan from my mom, from a family member. So it was definitely doable, and it helped out a lot. And then we revised some of the information that they had about Hopis, including the spellings and of labeling. And so that's kind of the end result and how we had maneuvered through these internal documents. And so the created documents that the end result in all of this were some transcripts of the meetings. We were able to go back and utilize some of those conversations in our next steps of our work. And then also, I created a document for the curatorial staff on how the foundational art that we were exhibiting is evolving in our communities today, and how we still use that as a foundation to be able to maneuver and create new art, such as like earrings. They put designs on pot holders. We're using intuitive ways to heighten, I guess you could say, these arts. And that's kind of what I wanted to share with them, to just kind of, teach them that this is how we're carrying on these arts today. And then also some more documents and connections we made was a possible collaboration of stewardship of items. Like I said, we don't have a museum here. So what we do is we work with institutions to hopefully someday share, be able to return these items, but until then, share the responsibility of the stewardship, the curatorial aspects. And so this is kind of what was the end result in how we're pushing forward past this exhibit, and also doing possible meetings with some potters who could potentially come down, look at the pottery, and kind of brainstorm of what their thoughts about the meanings of the designs and what it means to them. And so those are future possible collaborations for us. And then lastly, I just wanted to reinforce that tribes should not be afraid to tell the museum staff that maybe they shared too much, and just to please keep that to themselves. It was told in confidence to be able to care for the item or the subject respectfully. So just kind of keep that in mind, that although, you know, we are helping them and maybe there's something that we overstep, there's always that room to change, and just kind of remind them, well, maybe I shouldn't have said that, but you know, it was in great respect, so that way you will understand and it will better your work experience later with these types of objects. So that's my whole spiel on it. Any comments or questions, feel free to inbox in the chat. Thank you, Asquale.
So I came up with 3 different topics that come up a lot when exhibitions are being put together or being brainstormed, or just being put out there for a possible show, I guess. And one of the reasons why I chose these topics is because they're very complex, and they need to be understood from the context from which they were created or generated. Identity is a huge part of who we are as human beings. We go through the day and we shift through so many different types of identities as we engage or interact with our environment, people, or social situations, or fill in the blank. It's been documented and very well known that when a person that belongs to a certain cultural group, and it can be non-native and or native, when they leave their community, their identity becomes even more prominent as to who they are and where they come from originally. So there is definitely a benevolent and very positive aspect to it. However, increasingly, as I was explaining to one of the hosts earlier, identity is in some instances become institutionalized. And I'll give you an example, and I don't use these examples to berate or belittle or deny or demean or denigrate any group of people or any type of thought or philosophy, but it seemed to be the most one that came to my mind the quickest, and that is this whole idea of two-spirit people. As a kid growing up, I was a mama's boy. I admit it. I grew up around my grandmother. I grew up around my mom. I didn't really so much grow up with men. So what I learned was from women. And so as a kid growing up, you know, I never heard this term before. And so probably back about maybe 20 years ago, it suddenly started coming out into the open. And I understand the reasoning, you know, for it, and I understand the reason and why. However, the number of beliefs, the number of belief systems in this in Indian country and in the U.S. is enormous. We all have different ways of interpreting or understanding our world. And again, I never grew up with this idea of two-spirit people. To our traditional Aten people, all people were important. There was no one that was any better than anyone else, including the medicine people. They're human beings too. So now we have this idea out there of two-spirit, however that's defined, and it's starting to penetrate all areas of Indian country And this has created this new kind of institutionalized identity that art culture never had, that some cultures did. And that's why, you know, I want to make sure that I acknowledge them for having those. But increasingly, our tribes and because with Tohono O'odham, there's 7 different bands and dialects of O'odham language. And there's 7 different belief systems. Some people are very traditional, or they come from very traditional communities. Other people are not so much traditional. I've through my own experience, through my family's experience, through my mom's experience, I've learned a lot of different things just by hearing, you know, the way people have interacted and or responded to something. I was explaining to my host earlier, or the host earlier, that my mom taught Tohono O'odham language in the Tucson Unified School District, and she would tell me stories about that would happen or occur during her work time. And on one occasion, she was telling me this story about how she got a phone call from a parent of one of her students, and why the HELL was she teaching her children the Tohono O'odham language. We're Americans, we speak English, we don't speak Tohono O'odham anymore, we're modern, we're native. And my mom, she couldn't understand, where is this lady coming from? Because she grew up with my mom, and my mom knew her family, and the woman spoke fluently, grew up in the culture, but for some reason, she just, that was her, that was her belief system. Or so identity, again, can be very, very crafty and very tricky. So it's really important how we put ourselves out there. But more importantly to me is that we preserve and respect diversity, 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 diversity. Increasingly, the world is becoming globalized. And with that globalization, diversity is just slowly dissipating. And again, that's why for me, it's really important to recognize that diversity that exists in Indian country. Another concept that I've heard a lot of is that we all live on Turtle Island. And that may apply to a certain group of people from another part of the United States. But we believe that we live at the hikach. Hikach is the word for belly button, the belly button of the world. That's our belief system. So again, identity is really tricky, and it takes a lot of so to some people it comes really easy. To some other people, they have to really think about it. Somebody like me, I would have to think about it for a while. So I hope I made some sense. If anything that came out of that discussion is, again, my request for respect and maintaining diversity, 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 diversity. That's really important to me. And it was important in this exhibit that we put together. One of the things that I contributed to, which I immediately saw right away, is we live in southern Arizona, and yet we have so many few tribes from southern Arizona that have been represented in the past. But there's also a lot of different other tribes from the southern Arizona region that are not included. Mojave, Chemehuevi, Kuchan, Cocopah, Hualapai, Yavapai, Yaqui. There's some Yaqui stuff, but not as. But you know, we're in the Southwest, so you know, this is what we should be proud of, and to celebrate the diversity and the richness of the tribes of southern Arizona. So I hope I made sense and at least caused you to think about some things. And if you have questions, I'm more than welcome to listen to them and take them. So the next topic I choose that comes out a lot in exhibits and native art is sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is also another complex issue. I've had and have and continue to have discussions with colleagues that I went to school with, and colleagues that are tribal members, colleagues that are non-natives, and the fact remains is that American Indian tribes are domestic dependent nations. They depend on the federal government to guide them and to show them what they can and can't do. I'll give you an example. The hospital out in Sal's, Arizona, which is the main hospital for the whole reservation. They've been trying to get that thing remodeled and rebuilt because it was built in the 20s and 30s. Since I worked out there at the clinic back in the early 90s, and they were trying to get approval to get the hospital renovated and rebuilt. And they said what the process required was to get approval from Congress for them to make that change and to do the renovation. And it took them 25, 30 years before they were ever able to get assistance and approval from the government. Well, so sovereignty is a double-edged sword. There's also different kinds of sovereignty. There's cultural sovereignty, there's personal sovereignty, and there's sexuality sovereignty, all kinds of ways of looking at sovereignty. So anyway, that's what I wanted to point out about the idea of sovereignty. And the reason why the United States government has so much influence or power over the tribes is that in the U.S. Constitution, in the Commerce Clause, the United States government, the United States Congress, made them the only entity that could enact in any kind of trade or any kind of business with tribes. And it's a long story, and I don't really want to get into the details of it, but I think this is a lot to think about, and I hope I've made some sense. I hope I haven't gone around in circles. And so my next term that I wanted to talk about is assimilation. Now, assimilation can be negative. It can also be positive. Another word that I've used in the past is acculturation. Acculturation seems to be a little bit more benevolent as opposed to assimilation. We always think of assimilation as a bad thing. And in some ways, it is a bad thing. But in some ways, it's a good thing too. And that's why I also call this one a double-edged sword. Some people, there's other words too that to imply the same thing. Tradition, what I've learned in my studies and what I've talked to elders about is tradition changes with every second generation. So what was traditional for my grandmother will not necessarily be traditional to me. What's traditional for me may not be traditional for my great grandnephews and granddaughters. So it's always changing. And I'd like to hear what other people think about this whole term of assimilation. And so, yeah, those are the three things that I wanted to talk about. And again, I hope I made some sense and I haven't been chasing my tail. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Ruben. We've had half of our presentation, so Christine, Colleen, if anybody wants to chime in and comment at this point for like a little discussion, if there's anything you want to add to, this would be a good time just to check in, because even though Ruben says somebody will talk even if I don't ask, I'm going to ask anyway.
You'll never let me live that down.
Well, it's like a good reminder for me.
I don't remember it, but it's okay.
Well, in my thought process, I was looking at everything, and I was looking at, the words of like assimilation, and like everybody, it can, like Ruben said, it can mean good things, and the important thing is that we help each other take in and understand our living environments of culture and what that means to us. What if not forced assimilation, and like, what if history was switched, in the beginning, and we help others adapt to the new environment in the beginning? What outcome what we would have had, but we can do that now, and I believe that is what we did in this process. And so
Can I can I share a really quick story? You just reminded me, Colleen. And it has a little bit to do with the terminology that I use. I have a friend of mine. He did his bachelor's degree at Rosebud up on Lakota, North Dakota, I think. And he was telling me one time that there was an Indian family that had adopted a little white boy. When he was a baby. I don't know how they did it, but anyway, he grew up on the reservation, and everyone that talked to him on the phone or dealt with him through the phone, they thought he was full-blooded native because he spoke Sioux. He spoke the accents that we have in our different tribes, the little things that we say. Everybody thought he was white until they met him. And there was also a similar situation that was going on in the Midwest and Texas, especially where they had the Comanche Wars with the Apaches and the Mexicans and the Americans. There would be these groups of Comanches, say for instance, and they would raid a community or raid a village, and they would take people with them, usually kids or women. But they didn't necessarily take them as prisoners of war. They took them as part of their booty. And so these people, although they were, for instance, some of them might have been Mexican, they were eventually assimilated into Comanche culture, and vice versa too. Sometimes some Comanche children would be captured by Mexicans, and they would be placed in Mexican homes and raised as Mexicans. So this whole idea of who we are and identity and called color and language and this, that, and the other, that just gets shot out the cannon when you look at situations like this. They're still happening all the time, and right before our nose, and we don't even realize it. So how is this Sioux person at Rosebud, this white Sioux guy, how is he or any more or less Sioux than he is white? And who gets to say that?
Yep.
Um, sorry, go ahead.
Well, identity, it can take many forms, and it's important to us in our own way. And we get offended when our identity is not part of the bigger topic.
Mhm.
So I think with this exhibit, identity was a huge topic, but a starting point to include how each community was unique, distinct, and most importantly, how we define our own identity through our own voices and sovereignty expressed, within this process was exploring our independent authorities and decision making as a whole, and sharing that dominant power like willingly. I believe. Just my last thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you all for these wonderful discussions that we've had so far. I really appreciate hearing your ideas, how you've looked at things in these three main areas, Ruben, that you've been concentrating. And as I mentioned earlier about how I became an active listener, and how I come from this traditional, established type of museum curation, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about how I came at this. So this whole project was changing that curatorial model or that paradigm that I had always experienced. So this is just a humorous way of looking at it. You can see this here of the art curator, where it's viewed as a philosopher or a great orator, someone who is always spending time in a library, or someone who socializes at galleries or sells art or buys art. But in the end, what we really do, what you see in the corner there, is sit in front of the computer all day. And yes, there is a degree of some truth to that. I do spend a lot of time in front of my computer, but it's kind of a combination of all these different things. But when I began to work with this group and really diving into the Indigenous Arts exhibition, you know, just for example, Colleen brought up all these documents that we had shared with her. She asked, where have you displayed Hopi Katsinas before? And so I would send her exhibition photos. We had exchanged records on how we have things typed in the different databases. And, you know, this group looked at every single bit of those things that I had always just taken advantage of as either being fact or something that I could just reference easily. And so when we went into this collaborative method, it stripped away this whole stereotype of the art curator. And I realized that when we move into this thing, how do we do it? So as I mentioned before, it was a lot of listening. It was listening to the ideas of Indigenous identity, as Ruben had said earlier, and how to use these various cultural knowledges properly. And there are different types of knowledge that we are privy to and that we are not privy to. And I found through these conversations that I began to have a greater understanding of sovereignty and its relationships to works in the collection, how each piece represents, you know, for example, the land or the people, a various cultural tradition, politics, the list goes on. And even further, through this process of listening and changing this paradigm, I learned that there were deeper, more concerning issues, as Ruben had expressed, with assimilation of culture that occurs through collecting, misappropriating, and misconstruing different meanings and histories that we have institutionally in our holdings. And so we just, this whole collaborative element is how we can work to fix that. So what do we do? What do we do? In changing this existing paradigm, this traditional method that usually the curator is the one who does the layouts and the curator is the one who uses their training to create the label texts and the interpretation, helps build the ideas for tours so that our docents can move forward with what is being said. It's breaking that all down. And so it's different, taking a different action point to address how these things will occur. So it's how we are making the community be a part of the exhibition, what you want us to make sure that is said that represents each object in the way that is appropriate. So in a way, it's taking this circular view of you review and reflect, and then we go back and enact, and it just goes over again, review, reflect, and enact from these conversations as we continued forward. And so I started to feel a little metaphorical as I reflected on this process a little bit. And so I just felt like as we were going through this process, it was uncentering the way that the museum was positioned. And I felt like, well, what's a good way of thinking about that? Well, how about a fried egg, where you can still make a fried egg and it could still taste good, and it can cook properly, even though the yolk isn't quite in the middle. And so this whole idea of uncentering, it can still create a good product, but it doesn't have to be, set in that original model that you think it has to be. And also, I just have that greater understanding of the insider and outsider knowledge, and that respect has grown between them. So I feel like there's this idea with, again, with Rubin's 3 terms, the sovereignty, identity, and assimilation, that there's a lot more going on there that us, even though we're not cultural institutions, that we can be mindful of. And so it helps me become a better curator, to not always rely on a publication, that it's better to reach out to a community in addition and get the fuller story involved. And then that makes me and the museum a better responsible steward to this material. So I guess I'll mention some of these takeaways that I had, and Colleen, you know of this one for sure. We were able to make some updates to the collection because of our ongoing conversations. And one of them is this ancestral Hopi pot, this orange vessel on the left of your screen. This was something that I had on my mind for a few years as I evaluated it within the TMA collection. And I thought, I need to find out more about this piece, and I just needed better, idea of where to go, who to reach out to. And this is where Colleen really stepped in and helped us. We determined, even though it was already labeled as ancestral Pueblo, that it is actually considered ancestral Hopi. And so that helps us define a region, a people. It gives that object life again, that we're able to, have it back into its context again. In addition, this Navajo or Dina rug that's on the right, in one of our early conversations, this is before the co-curator system was set up, we were having conversations with different artists and members of the community, trying to figure out what direction to start from. And there was a weaver who looked at our collection, and we had on our label that says this was ermine. It was a weasel. And he said, well, I don't think that's what it is. The horned toad is most likely what it's depicting, because that is a very important animal in our culture, in our religion, in our traditions, etc. And so we were able to go back into our records, make that correction. And again, it's really developing these more accurate stories for the museum to convey to our visitors.
Great. Thanks, Christine. So I am going to go next, but I'm going to be real fast just because I want to make sure we get to the questions that are coming in. So at the Tucson Museum of Art, I really just want to talk a little bit about what does this actually mean, this community-based approach, and I'll echo kind of what Colleen and Christine and Ruben has already said, but I really want to stress the fact that it's long-term and systematic, right? So we're not talking about that single conversation or that initial consultation. We're really thinking about what it means to develop long-term relationships with communities that are represented in our collection and that are living in our surrounding communities. So what is different about this is that for us, our community curators or stakeholders have this role from the inception, right? Identifying kind of artworks and themes and all of these ideas, rather than coming in at a midpoint or a later point in our exhibition development. And right, we're even thinking about this as we're developing programs. So how this panel came together, right? Ruben had some things he wanted to talk about. Colleen had some topics she wanted to talk about. Christine and I had really important key takeaways we wanted to share that we've learned, and how could we develop a cohesive presentation that took all 4 of our perspectives into consideration when we were putting together, you know, a 90-minute talk. So really thinking about how you're working together from the inception to kind of whatever your product might be, and then thinking about what comes next, right? It doesn't end with your end product. Really, there shouldn't be one, right? We're constantly trying to figure out what comes next. And so, you know, I wanted to think a little bit about what it meant to develop an exhibition through ideas of identity, sovereignty, assimilation, and then collaboration, right? For me, that was really essential in this process. All of these things are really complex and evolving. There are not a singular or universal way to approach it. We needed to be responsive and acknowledge the fact that things were political, right? Identity, sovereignty, these issues that we were talking about are political constructs, and they have political meaning, right? And we needed to be intentional in what we were sharing. So as caretakers of artworks, we as museum workers have a responsibility to be good stewards and collaborators. Understanding and being open to sometimes difficult conversations about sovereignty, identity, and assimilation helps us to build more complete stories, approaches to exhibition development, and offer new insights to programs and our interpretation, right? And Colleen, this is something that you said that really considers, like, is constantly resonating with me, right? Like, we really need to think about what's best interest of the artworks in our communities and not just the museum, right? Like, how can we expand our understanding of what it means to take care of an artwork, right? It means more than just being this institution. So now I have shared that Colleen and Ruben's voices echo in my head at random points during the day. And really for us, this community-based curation is a living thing, right? We know that things will have to change and evolve as we learn more, right? We're acknowledging the fact that it is a broadening our approaches, it's changing our understanding. And really for me, it often brings up more questions than answers. And that's okay, right? We don't have to have a perfect answer for everything. And Ruben, you talked about this a little too, so I'm glad that we're all kind of touching on similar points, but what changed with this exhibition, right? Like, where can you really see the difference, right? We tried to center on place, and maybe our collection in this area is a limitation, but we really wanted to make it clear that the land that we're on, the space that we're within, is our where we are, where our home is, right? We worked to decenter traditional museum authority. There was a total overhaul of our interpretive approaches, meaning a lot of times a single curator, right? Christine, maybe you're writing a lot of the labels, and maybe I'm coming in and editing them. But this time there's not a single cohesive voice that is telling the stories within the exhibition spaces. We changed how our Indigenous arts exhibition was in the past, because sometimes we had included Euro-American artists that were depicting Indigenous peoples or themes, and that's no longer included in the exhibition space. Like I said, to our interpretive approaches, we're inclusive of multiple voices, both within the interpretation and label writing, but also with how the whole exhibition came together. We are trying to be more transparent in our labels about the process and the museum's role as a caretaker. And the exhibition developed only through shared knowledge, right? So these were kind of these changes that were able to happen because of this process. And things that I learned in this process was that we really need to slow down, right? Community-based curation takes a little more time, and that's okay, right? We can change our internal working schedules to honor the process. It's really important to listen And this does mean that sometimes we have to relinquish control and be open to emerging and new ideas. At the very end, and Christine, I'm going to rag on you now, because I guess that's just fair. At the very end, Christine was asking all the time, when do you think we're going to have a checklist? When do you think it'll be ready to have a checklist? And that's because a lot of external people were asking about a checklist, right? They wanted a final product. But I was like, you know, it'll happen soon. We're going to have to just work with what we're doing. It'll be okay. So you can see I didn't even finish my thought here on the slide, but it can be a source of anxiety, but it also can be a really effective a way to change, and it's always worth it, right? Like maybe it's stressful in the moment that it's happening, but in the end, it definitely feels worth it. And so that's it for me. It was like the speed version.
Can I respond to something?
Yeah.
Well, what I wanted to respond to, and it's just telling some more stories about things that we come across when we're doing research. I know Colleen had talked extensively about correcting the information for some of the things that are in museums already. I run into that all the time. For example, when I was doing the photo research for the exhibit, I always find things that are mislabeled, but I stopped trying to tell the curators because it's too lengthy of a process to get it changed. And maybe that's what needs to also be changed too, is the ability to see that go through quicker, and it doesn't become this administrative bureaucratic mess. Just another really quick story. I did a pottery workshop at UCal Berkeley about 15, 20 years ago. And Berkeley were storing skeletons of native people from California in their Campanile, which is one of the big towers that sits right in the middle of the campus. And the students I was dealing with the Indian club there. And at that moment in that time and space, they were trying to locate all the missing pieces of Ishi, the native man who was the last of his tribe, the Yahi. When he died, they dismembered him into multiple parts. And the students were like driving, you know, get this man back together. We need to put him to rest. And it became such a huge problem for them. I don't know if it ever resolved, because there was one last missing item that they couldn't find. And I'm not going to tell you what it is because it's a little bit disrespectful to talk about it, but it's sometimes these things are easy. Sometimes these things are just like, you just want to walk away from them and say, I can't, this is too much. I can't do this. I don't mean to make jest of it or light of it or anything. It's the process to get those things fixed. Sometimes they're so hard and so long and drawn out. At least that's been my experience. I don't know, maybe you've had a different experience, Colleen, than I have.
Oh, I definitely have a Berkeley story too that I've already shared with Marianna and Christine. I just think that, you know, telling these types of stories helps that change and helps it put into perspective. And it's tough to hear, and a lot of times people want to shy away from it, but also, you know, there's that need to tell that story, tell those emotions, tell the end result. You know, that's what exhibit should be about, you know, truthfully telling about these situations and how it makes everyone feel, even the people who want to turn away from it. You know, I think those stories are just as much important as our own tribal voices. So yeah, thank you for that and reminding us that it can go from real light to heavy and real fast, you know, in these types of learning environments.
Yeah.
I think also for me, I think that, so a lot of things are hard, it takes time, right? And you learn things that make you uncomfortable or you feel responsible, even though maybe you weren't involved. And I use humor all the time as kind of like my coping strategy, right? So like not to make light of things like you're both saying, but also the humor helps to get you to the next point, right? To make you sustain through the times where you're like, well, I guess nothing's ever going to change.
Yeah.
Well, humor is in everybody's blood, you know. We can go at it for days, you know, within our communities with humor and just about ourselves. So, you know, that's also something to embrace too.
Yeah. All right, I have a bunch of questions. So I'm going to just start kind of reading them off from the beginning. So one of the first questions we got is kind of coming back to this idea about TMA's permanent collection of Indigenous arts. And so is it viewed as disrespectful for TMA not to be inclusive in representing cultural items from many of the Southwest tribes that aren't included? And what might we be able to do to correct this situation?
From any of us?
Yeah, from anyone.
I think you've already done a huge part in addressing all of that just by this exhibit. Is I still remember in the beginning when, you know, I hate to bring up those things, but as far as like, you know, the collections that you had, but it wasn't really an accurate representation of Southern Arizona where the museum sits. But I believe you did a really excellent attempt at trying to, you know, change that. Not perfect. Ideally, I would like to get all those other tribes opportunities to highlight their native art. I know the Human Indians have a really beautiful tradition of beaded pectorals to go over a woman's her dress when they do their traditional dancing. There's so many different things for others to experience from other cultures in Arizona, in Southern Arizona.
Yeah, I think it keeps, like as Marianna mentioned, this long-term partnership, you know, that's something to build off of, that's something to plan for, you know, and help correcting that. And not only that, like teaching others about that. Maybe they just don't know, you know, and so that's the part of sharing it and something that can be addressed and even enriched, you know, both institution wise and community wise. And I'm just so proud of you all for acknowledging, you know, the area which, you know, you're at with to those tribes. And I think that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to follow up on both of those responses, TMA at first thought, oh, well, we have this collection, it can be our anchor. And then we realized we are missing a lot of things. And so through this experience, we have evaluated the collection a lot farther, and we have found where our gaps are. You know, with this exhibition, we reached out to the Amarin Foundation and were able to acquire loans of beautiful baskets of, you know, elaborate motifs. And we hope to have a long-term, you know, relationship with them. And we are looking at acquiring more works from our region for the permanent collection. And so this has all just spurred a lot of this in motion.
Yeah. Great. And you know, just to add to that, Christine, but we're also at this moment where we're thinking about our collections plan and thinking about what our focus should be. So it's perfect to kind of take what we're learning and integrate it into a document that'll be like institutionalized for us. All right. So Colleen, this question is specifically for you. So Colleen, so thinking about representing or being kind of an arm of Hopi culture, How did you feel about the museum's representation of kind of the Hopi section? And do you feel as though the overall presented the information and the display covered your concerns that we talked about in this presentation and throughout the whole process? This person was here on Saturday and saw a lot of the section text that we wrote that kind of talked about NAGPRA and cultural patrimony and sovereignty, I guess, but just kind of reflecting on what happened and how you felt about it in the end.
I was overall pleased with the Hopi section. I put into consideration that, you know, Hopi is not the only tribe in the Southwest, as mentioned before, and especially in southern Arizona. You know, I was really reluctant to have that consultation for our tribe, and I was very happy with how we updated the information, how there was future shared collaboration about repatriation. The spellings were incorporated and included, and I really appreciated too the fact that it was also written in Spanish, you know, so it could resonate with those cultures. And so I was thankful for that. And I kind of shared this earlier with Marianna and Christine that the exhibit hit home for me in areas of community because I knew some of the artists, I knew the process for baskets. And during this pandemic, you know, we are not able to do many of the ceremonies and that have a critical role in our living communities. And it was worrisome and sad, you know, it contributes to so much loss we had already experienced, losing people, losing ceremonies, losing language. And so I was thankful that this exhibit reminded me again of how lucky we are and how thankful I should be. So overall, I was very pleased with the exhibit and how it came out and how we had worked together to make those changes.
All right, so I have another question, and it's not directed at anybody. So anybody who feels like they want to answer or speak to this is more than welcome to. How does contemporary Indigenous art differ when including Indigenous community voices and collaborators? If the works are not ritual, and do they go through a similar cultural assessment?
I would think so. I believe so, because then it's identified in which way it should go. I think we did that early on in the process about the subject of items being displayed if they were used in rituals versus items who are deemed as instruments or gifts in that sense. So you know, everything's changing. Things are becoming more contemporary. Who's to say that it has no connection to being historical? So a lot of times you just have to weigh that out with the community you're working with.
I was gonna, I'm sorry, are you done, Colleen? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was thinking about the exhibit. I'm not sure if it's still there. It probably is, but the boarding school experience exhibit that they had at the Heard Museum, that was, I believe, I think there was multiple people. I don't know that for certain, but I'm going to assume that there was multiple collaborators in that. That's a topic that is very sensitive. But at the same time, having read a lot of the literature, a lot of the stories that were written by students as adults about the boarding school experience, that the boarding school experience can range all the way from the very horrific to the very, very benign and very productive. That to me is something that it has to be dealt with very, very, very delicately, because it brings up a lot of bad memories for some people.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of balance that, you know, when you're dealing, the reality is dealing with historical trauma and present trauma, right? And how do you navigate that space?
And, you know, I was fortunate enough to experience that. Sorry.
Okay.
When my grandmother would, we would take her to the post office, and it's in Salesman, and when she was in her 80s. And my grandma would always stop and talk to people all the time. That's just the way she was. But there was always this group of ladies, and they would get together and they would just go at it, and it was just so sad. It made you want to cry. And when I asked my mom, how come, you know, why does my grandma always cry when she's with these people? And she told me that my grandmother was mature enough when she went into the boarding school system that she became a surrogate mother to a lot of the students. And when they were crying and they were homesick, she would go over there and tell them it was going to be okay. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
It's okay. You know, it's important to remember that there's always a balance. Yeah.
It made you sad, you know, just, yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm done.
Thanks for sharing, Ruben. I think it's important for us to think about ways that, right, like even if something's contemporary, it can bring up reminders, right, and have this ripple effect that we don't anticipate, right? And as we do this work, it's really important for us to consider that reality.
Yeah, my grandmother was a strong person, I tell you that. She went through a lot, and I'm just glad that I knew that part about her, that she did these things for these kids to make them feel better. Anyway, we have any more questions?
Yes. So one of the questions is about how does TMA reciprocate or compensate for the value of the work, knowledge, and expertise of tribal members in this collaborative process? So we paid people. I want to say that flat out. And I know sometimes that's a hard thing to do, right? Like institutions with small budgets as us, but you got to make space to do things correctly. And you want to honor people's times and expertise. I'll just say that flat out. But does anybody else want to speak to that question too?
I can. I think how it's being reciprocated for me is that I'm allowed to be able to further my work on this platform with virtual reality, or I mean not virtual reality, but being on a virtual platform, and then also furthering that work and massaging those relationships between my tribe and different departments who are going to deal with this future work. And that's what if that's what it means to push along this work in the shift that we're finding ourselves in museums, then that has to be done. And so if anything, that's how it's being reciprocated in not only our tribal communities, but institutions as well. So I believe that's where we're getting paid too, and it's having its domino effect, and it's leading to other future exhibitions, including other people. And so that's where I feel like it was worth more than just getting paid.
Yeah, the experience was invaluable, and I thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So I have a couple more questions, and I know we're getting near time. So one of the questions actually, and anybody can speak to this, but about kind of Western art. Should our focus on Western art differentiate all Indigenous art? And what is Western cowboy art that includes Indigenous items. So is it dangerous to totally separate out these pieces? So separate out kind of Western art that has historically kind of depicted and dealt with Indigenous imagery, I guess. And then what might we do to kind of address this within the genre of Western art? I don't know, Christine, if you want to tackle that one.
Well, I think I'd rather hear from my fellow panelists, and then I can jump in, because
Okay.
this is something that is a big issue. Yeah.
The only one thing that I could think of right away is go to the archery and see how they do it.
Mhm.
You guys know
Yeah.
what the archery is, right?
Yeah.
Western art. Yeah. So
Well, I
I've
think
been there. I've been there a couple of times, and I think I was impressed by how they put it out there. They had paintings by California artists, non-native, of of a native scene. And I mean, my experience was that it was respectful. It was, and considering that California has one of the worst genocidal records of all of Indian country, the state of California, what is known as the state of California, was the most populated state of all the U.S. states. There was over 900 tribes at one time. Most of them are gone, and they were gone because the gold miners killed them. Well, most of them anyway, but yeah, so I just putting that out there.
I think it can only be as complicated as you make it seem, you know. I know that some things are disrespectful to other people to talk about, but why not acknowledge that it is being disrespectful and for these reasons, you know? And to me, it shows that we were still there in that time. You know, a lot of us Native people have were subject to adapting to livestock, becoming cowboys. You know, it fits somehow in our culture to where we actually made it adapted to it in our religion, in our culture. You know, like for us, we later on adapted, you know, a cow kachina, you know, and so that plays a crucial role in how we make those connections, what good it brought for our people, and how we still invite people to be a part of that experience. And so I think if you make it a point for it to be problematic, it will be problematic. But that is our goal and our role as curators, educators, just these places of enhancing those learning experiences. So, I mean, if you know what you're doing, and if, of course you're going to get in trouble, but there's always that role too of admitting and healing those grievances. So, you know, you can only make good off of it once you make that mistake, and that's just a life lesson in general. You know.
Yeah, yeah, you learn some of your best lessons when you make mistakes. I've had it happen, and even if you're from the same culture and you grew up with the same ideas, does not keep guarantee you from getting into trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
just for not knowing.
Yeah.
it also lets you know maybe you are doing something right. You know, you offend
True.
a little group of people. You know.
Yeah. All right, I have one last question, and it's directed at me, but I'm going to open it up to everybody because I think it's an important question of, can you give an example of using humor to kind of make your way through these difficult conversations and the discomfort that might come with changing practices? For me, I tend to make fun of myself. And that is that it makes me laugh, you know, and then maybe I'm hoping it'll trickle on. So I kind of like use myself as like either this is not what, don't do this, and this is why I've like messed up in these situations, and kind of laugh about it, right? Like, you know, the greatest mistakes you make are the ones that inform where you're going next. are sharing like little stories that kind of made me giggle in a moment, right? And just kind of, sure, it's kind of hard to have these conversations, but there are also these like silly, funny little moments that make it all worth it. So, you know, I was once teaching somewhere and I had a little kid stick their finger up my nose because they had never seen anybody with nose rings, right? So things like that, I think, bring kind of humor and lightness to even like a strange situation. So
I think, Colleen, maybe you agree with me, but laughter is a huge part of Indian society and Indian life. If you know how to make people laugh, you're everyone's friend. Just about anyway. I mean, I've had friends, like colleagues here in Tucson that have met with the Tonaltan people for whatever reason, different reasons. And the question they always ask me, why are you people so quiet? They're waiting for someone to crack the first joke. So I don't know, but they love to laugh. They love to laugh. I'll tell you that.
Well,
They
Marianna
love
and
to
I,
laugh.
we went to visit the Cultural Council, and we were both nervous going in, and we were telling them about this project, and I can't really remember what I said, but I sometimes I have a tendency to just, you know, make some offhanded, dry joke, and you know, I said it, and they burst out laughing, and it just calmed the room. It was like we were all
Mhm.
friends,
There you go.
and I think that really helped us, you know, through that
Mhm.
evening.
yeah.
One thing to remember though, although it's all in humor and fun, but I know traditionally we tend to make fun of each other's, make fun, and our generation and everybody these days, they get real hurt about it. So you kind of have to reinforce that with reassurance, like, I'm laughing at you because you made this mistake, or I made fun of it because this reason, and maybe next time you should try better. You know, there's always that talk after you get hurt about something or you feel bad about it. But then in the end, you know, you're tough as bricks later. You know, my uncle used to tease me all the time about my bread. Like when I was first learning how to make tortillas, he would put it up and say, "What state is this? Arkansas, Mississippi," you know, because he could never
Yeah.
get it like a circle. But now I'm an expert and he don't ever say anything about my bread now, you know. So it's just a learning process. And you know, sometimes we're just too quick to get hurt. This generation, we don't know what it's
Sure.
like to be criticized and for a good reason. And so that's kind of what we have to remind ourselves after the humor part is over. Go up to that person, reassure them, I wasn't laughing at you to laugh at you, but for this reason. So, you know, there's a bigger part of using humor to get the point across that we often shouldn't leave open-ended, but, you know, have some kind of closure to it later.
Yeah. Well, we are at 12:30, so we did a perfect job of staying to our 90-minute promise. So thank you everyone who joined us today. We did record this, so we will make it available in the coming weeks on our YouTube link, and we can share it out with everybody. Thank you to Colleen, Christine, and Ruben for joining me today in this virtual space. It was such a treat to hear from you all again, and you know, get an opportunity to look back at our process and our exhibition now.
Thank you for the
Yep.
privilege of your time. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Thank you all, and take care of each other. So, you know, we're still not out of this sickness. Take care of each other's and go home and hug everybody you love and just be good to each other.
Yep.
Yep.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.